Welcome to the Plant Cunning Podcast,
where we explore our relationship to plants, other people, and the mysteries of nature.
Coming to you from the high Allegheny Plateau in central New York.
We are your hosts, AC Stauble
and Isaac Hill. Okay, welcome to another episode of the Plant Cunning Podcast, and this week we have Marcos Patchett on the show. And Marcos is an herbalist in the UK. He's written two fantastic books about chocolate. This is the newer, smaller one. He's also got a big, giant one, a tome called The Secret Life of Chocolate.
Shall I hold that up?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, hold it up.
That's like the big doorstop version.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's big. And so you're also a medical astrologer, which is another fun thing to talk about. So hopefully we'll get to talk about chocolate and astrology, two of my favorite things in the world. So how are you today, Marcos?
I'm pretty good. Yeah, I'm pretty good. Thank you, Isaac. It's funny. We were talking before, and you said you got a slight cold. I was feeling a little bit coldy today as well. It's just like the season, isn't it? So I'm dosing myself up with herbs as we speak. But other than that, pretty good. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I just ran myself down a little bit too much, and that's usually how it is for me. If I didn't get enough sleep, like I was hunting out in the morning, getting up too early, and that just did it to me. But,
it's easy to do. I don't know. It's a standard human thing. I find I think I've got more energy than I have to spend, and then I sort of like overspend my energy a little bit, and then go, okay, so we're there now. So just that reset. And I think every year I'm getting slightly better at it, but it still happens.
Yeah, it's a seasonal thing. So our first question generally is, what brought you to the plant path? And so we also, if you're an astrologer, more on the other side, what brought you to astrology or magic, but you're doing all these things. So what brought you to the plant path and the planet path?
Okay, that's cool. All right. So the plants, I think it's a two-part question. The first part is two-part answer, really. The first part is one of my granddads was actually a chemist with Glaxo, who's a big pharmaceutical manufacturer, but he lived in the country and he always used to make like herbal wines in the summer, and he knew a lot about plants. And he also was kind of interested in the sort of like weirdo side of plants. Like he had like The Secret Life of Plants on his bookshelf, and I remember seeing that as a kid. And he used to get me, and he had a big little herb, well, not a massive one, but a little herb garden where he had like tansy and like loads of stuff growing. So it was sort of around me as a kid, and I didn't really notice it. He used to get me helping him make herbal wines in the summer, and I used to think it was really boring. But I just remember like that was there. And then when I was a teenager, I was really into art, and I sort of went and did an art degree in London. I moved to London to do that. Ended up partying too much, taking too many drugs, and basically just sort of like causing myself a bit of party damage. And then I was looking for ways to do that without damaging myself. And so I sort of came into it backdoor via Chinese herbal medicine, because I remember going to a Chinese pharmacy and say, do you have anything that can keep me awake for 24 hours without damaging me? And they were like, well, we've got this ginseng. And I was like, okay, fine. And they gave me a bunch of instructions on how to use it, which I totally ignored and just took it all before I went out. And I found, because I was 18 and stupid, and I found out that when the day after I felt okay, and I was used to feeling like trash the day after, I didn't really notice it doing anything. I felt like I hadn't taken anything, but the day after I felt fine. I was like, oh, this is interesting. So then I just got totally obsessed. And this was like 1997 maybe. And I got kind of obsessed with ginseng. And I remember this is like early internet days, really. So I wrote off to the Encyclopedia Britannica and like asked for loads of fact sheets on ginseng. Nice. And they sent me those. And one of them was like, this herb can restore the organism to homeostasis. I was like, that's not supposed to be possible. But then right at the end of the article, it said, but according to Western science, like many scientists believe this herb is a placebo. And it's like, well, it can't be both. Do you know what I mean? And I was like, I've tried doing this. And at this age, I was like blasting my brain out with all these different substances. Like, I know this stuff does something because I can feel it. Do you know what I mean? And so I ended up buying ginseng in every form, like root, powder, pills, extracting the powder and just like playing with it at home and experimenting with it. And then it sort of branched out into other herbs. So at first it was like me looking for naughty party substances, like what herbs are stimulants, what herbs can get you high. And then eventually it became, oh, but this is amazing. Like sage can do this. Like sage can do this. This is a kitchen herb. So it sort of branched out from there. And then basically I'd finished my art degree. I knew I wasn't going to be an artist. I had a part-time job by this point in a health food shop, most of which I spent time just advising most of the customers not to buy the stuff from the health food shop, but to go to a proper herbalist. How I didn't get sacked, I don't know. But that was, so I was already kind of into it. And then basically a bunch of my friends just said, you have to study herbal medicine. Because I was like, oh, I don't know what to do now. And so I asked my friends for advice, and they were like, you need to study herbal medicine because you're just boring everyone with it all the time. It's like obvious to everyone else but you that you need to study this. So I was like, okay, fine. So that's what I ended up doing. And that was totally the right path. You know, as soon as I started the course, and like I knew I was in amongst my people. Like I'd had a year of sort of like being out of it and just sort of mixing with lovely people, but who I didn't feel connected to. And then on that first day, like everyone was the same kind of weirdo. And it was just like amazing. It was like, wow, these are my people. So that was that. Yeah.
And where did you study?
That was Middlesex University. So at the time, like late 90s, early thousands, there were like a few universities that were doing Western herbal medicine degrees, like BScs and MScs in the UK. There was a little period of like 10 years where they were really in vogue for sort of political reasons, really, because they thought that herbal medicine, Western herbal medicine, was going to go on the NHS in the UK. It was going to be made available on the National Health Service until I think about 2014, or maybe a bit sooner than that, something like that, like after the 2010s anyway. In the 2010s, that they had another review, and that review concluded that while there was a lot of evidence for Western herbal medicine and acupuncture, the cost of making them available on the NHS would exceed any revenue. So after that, the government just stepped back from it, and all the universities started stepping back from it. So now there's like one university remaining in the UK that does a degree, and all the rest of the herbal courses have gone back online. And the courses are still freaking amazing. I think some of the courses now are even better than the degrees that we did, which were, by the way, 4-year full-time degrees, or 4 or 5 year. You know, they were hardcore with 350 clinical hours and lots of stuff. Some of the courses now are even harder, but they don't get that little degree label, which, speaking astrologically, as someone with a strong, like not strong, but an angular Saturn in my chart, I like the proof. I like the receipts. I like to be able to say, look, I prove I'm that thing. So
totally.
So yeah, I just caught that lucky little window where we were able to do the degrees. But I also wish they bring apprenticeships back, but that's a whole other story. Because for non-academic people, I felt that path excluded some really brilliant herbalists. Like there were some people who started the degree at the same time as me who were freaking amazing herbalists. They were using the herbs already. They were really familiar with the practical use of them. But all of the academia, they were kind of a little bit allergic to. So if those guys had had the opportunity to go via an apprenticeship route, that would have worked out really well. So it just seems like a human thing that we seem to just like go to this extreme or that extreme. And it's like, could we not just like open out different routes, you know? But anyway, whatever. Personal.
Were there any other like teachers or mentors that you've found influenced you a lot in your path, either through herbalism or astrology?
Yes. So herbalism, I guess, I mean, obviously, like we had some really good tutors at uni, but outside of that, I think it was Graham Tobin, who, I don't know if you guys know his name. He wrote a book called Pepper's Medicine, which is amazing. And I highly recommend to all of your listenership, in addition to my own books, of course. But it's an amazing book, which is all about the sort of like the Western history of herbal medicine, but mainly focusing on that sort of astrological tradition as well. And I read his book while I was at uni, and he was somebody who was an astrologer who then migrated to herbal medicine. I mean, he does both now. He's great. So reading his book, I then did a placement with him in his clinic, and he still currently lectures at, I think it's Lancaster University in the UK on the herbal medicine degree there. So he's a mentor. And then obviously through him, I became aware of Culpepper's Herbal and like Culpepper's work. So obviously Culpepper died 400 years ago, but I'd kind of like cite him as a mentor because he's like amazing. So, you know, and then, I think, and then in terms of astrology, I would say influences started off at the London School of Astrology with Sue Tompkins, who's more of a modern astrologer, whereas I'm more interested in the traditional stuff now, but she's a modern astrologer. She was great, fantastic teacher. And then later on, I was quite influenced by John Frawley, who's not everybody's cup of tea. He's a bit controversial. He's a bit of a Catholic and kind of like slightly acerbic, but I really enjoy his work, and I think his astrology is great, and he really got me into the traditional astrology, so sort of like William Lilly style stuff. So yeah. Anyway,
yeah, I have his book on horary, which is pretty good.
The horary textbook, yes, it's amazing. It's really clear. Like, yeah.
And then, one book, wasn't it called something like the True Astrology or something?
Yeah, the real astrology. Yeah. And so he's very he's not afraid to pick a fight. Let's put it that way. Which I kind of, I'm a Scorpio rising, Aries sun. I'm kind of like, yes, bring it on. So I'm okay with that, but. He's kind of controversial, but I don't think he's right on everything, even technically, but I do think he has a really, really brilliant mind for astrology, and just really, I love that the way some people have of boiling things down to very clear, because it's that whole thing. If you can't explain something simply, maybe you don't understand it that well. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah. So that's how you got into astrology, was through Cultivation's medicine, basically?
Yeah, but through Graham Tobin initially, and then I went and studied at the LSA, which is more sort of modern astrology, just because that was the astrology that I wanted to find an astrology school, and I landed on them. And then I was there for 2.5 years, and then I found Frawley's books, and then I was like, oh, this is what I want to do. So I sort of switched lanes a bit. Yeah.
Oh,
cool. Yeah. So what prompted it seems like there's an obsession with chocolate.
Yeah. Well, it was a couple of things. I've always liked it and been drawn to it, and I sort of said in the big book, this one was a 14-year sort of research project, and I started thinking about it. I didn't start researching it until 2006, when I graduated in 2006 from the herbal degree. So I was like, right, I started doing it then, but I was already thinking about it sort of even in 2001 too, because I always loved dark chocolate, and particularly when I was in my sort of post naughty party phase, I got really into dark chocolate. And I've always had this notion as a herbalist, particularly, that and this isn't always true, of course, you can't make things generalities into definitives, but it's often the case that the original form of a thing is more powerful than the sort of mass produced, sort of slightly potentially devitalized form of a thing. So right. I'd always had this feeling that chocolate, there was a lot more to it.
Yeah, that's even 85% dark chocolate compared to a Hershey's Kiss or something.
Yeah, for sure. Even that. But I always noticed that whenever I ate dark chocolate, I just feel objectively more comfortable in my own skin, and I perceive myself as being a bit more attractive or a bit more likable. And it was subtle, but it was there and it was consistent. And I was like, this is really interesting. And when I got one book that was an inspiration for me was Jonathan Ott's book. He's an ethnobotanist. He wrote Pharmacocoa about things like ayahuasca and stuff like that. But he also wrote a really little book in the 80s called Chocolate Addict, which I love. But he's very sort of pharmacocentric, which I love the pharmacology, but he's also very the sort of what I call the Victorian drug model, the one plant, one drug, plants like apples of vitamin C with packaging, I say in my book. Do you know what I mean? That idea that a plant has an active ingredient and the rest of it is just sort of biological wrapping paper. So he sort of says, cacao, the main ingredient in cacao is theobromine. All of its psychoactivity can be attributed to theobromine. And on reading that, I thought, well, maybe, but I sort of disagree, because you can say even qualitatively there's differences between coffee, tea, and chocolate, and that might be a caffeine dosing thing, but I'm willing to bet a limb possibly that it's not just that. So there was personal reasons that I liked it. The second reason was just that I thought everybody likes chocolate. So if I wrote a book about chocolate, it would be a useful kind of Trojan horse way of getting people interested in ideas in complementary medicine and sort of thinking about things in a different way, using chocolate as a way of introducing some of those ideas to people. So that was my incentive. So those two sort of driving forces were the main thing. And then the third thing was just that pure selfish thing of, I like chocolate. I want to find the very best form of this substance and make it and be able to supply myself with it for the rest of my life. Those are my three motives. Yeah. And then I can tell other people how to do it as well. So whatever. Yeah.
So what did you find the holy grail of chocolate? What is the best form?
I don't know if I ever found the holy grail of chocolate, Isaac, but I do think, just from my research, and this is opinion based on research, but it's still an opinion. I don't know that I found a definitive thing, but for me, the Criollo cacao, which is the sort of main form of cacao that's used in chocolate world, because it's the more expensive, it's slightly higher in caffeine, it's harder to grow, it's more disease susceptible. And that was the strain of cacao that was really developed by centuries of hybridization in Central America and Mesoamerica. And so we know that cacao originated in the Amazon basin. And there were cultures like we now know in Ecuador and stuff who were using cacao in drinks and stuff, maybe 5,000 years ago or something, 4,000, 5,000 years ago. But then it was imported into Central America, into what modern day Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, whatever. And that's where they cultivated it and really refined it and sort of evolved the Criollo subtype, what's now known as the Criollo subtype, which taste-wise, it's less bitter. It has a slightly higher caffeine content, and it's slightly lower in the antioxidants, but not really, because it's just lower in the anthocyanins, which pharmacologically are the purple constituents that make the sort of forastero cacao, so-called, from the Amazon more sour. But the Criollo has more procyanidins, which are also antioxidant, which are more the form of the antioxidants, which are a bit more bioavailable. So anyway, I don't want to get to, because I love my chemistry as well, so I don't want to get too into the weeds with that. But so the point is, the Criollo subtype, it was developed in Central America. It was developed in that part of the world. So my suspicion was going in, and I don't think it's pure confirmation bias, that my experience has shown that the forms of cacao which are the most, let's call it what it is, psychotropic, that are the most, that give you, it's not a buzz, it's just like that heart open. I say in the book, it's like a quarter of an MDMA tab or something like that. It's like that heart opening thing. That, I think, is particular to some of the Criollo subtypes that were developed in Mesoamerica. Can I prove that definitively? No, I can't. I can only say that anecdotally through my experience of having it, and we can refer to the differences in chemistry between the different types. And we can refer historically to the fact that that was the region of the world where they spent the longest focusing on this substance and where it became super central to the culture, So yeah, and I think so. There's growing regions in Central America, what's called the Soconusco, which is the west coast, sort of just going down from like what is now the southern part of Chiapas in Mexico, down the west coast of Guatemala, down into Honduras, and then a little bit on the east coast in, where is it? My brain's just gone blank. It's the east coast anyway. There's a Tabasco, that's it, in Mexico. So those two growing zones are where the best cacao. It's a very particular fussy plant. It needs humidity. It needs like that sort of all these sets of environmental factors to be just right for it to grow. So I think that's where the best cacao grows. There is a spanner in the works, though. There, shut me up at any time, by the way, because I can talk continually. Otherwise, otherwise, okay, cool. So yeah, there is a spanner in the works there, though, because no blame to any governments here, but the governments in a lot of Central American countries like Mexico and Guatemala and whatever, a lot of those cacao growing countries have been subsidizing farmers for like several decades now to hybridize their cacao to make it more hardy for higher yields. So they can get, because I can't blame them for that, obviously, but it does mean that some of the indigenous chemotypes of cacao are now, there's no pure sort of like traditionally grown, 100% traditionally grown Criollo, but there are some that are pretty close, I think. And there are certainly some varieties of cacao that I've bought the beans and made into drinks that are a lot more potent. And I can maybe talk pharmacologically about why I suspect that might be. I have no hard proof. I have a bunch of hypotheses that I recount in the big book, and then I sort of touch on in the little book just because there's less space. But yeah, I think it's down to what I refer to as the fairy dust constituents, like the tiny amount of phenethylamine and anandamide and these diketopiperazines that are produced during roasting that we don't even know what they do, but they cross the blood-brain barrier. So yeah, there's several, about 40 of them in cacao, and they're produced on roasting. They're like two amino acids joined together. They get through the blood-brain barrier. A few of them that have been researched in other contexts, like they find some of them increase like neuronal growth. Some of them maybe have antimicrobial activity. There's a bunch of different activities in them. We don't really know what they do or how they contribute to the effects. So that's pretty startling. But these fairy dust constituents, like the amount of phenethylamine in cacao, so many websites talk about it, but it's so tiny. But then cacao's, some of the antioxidants, some of the procyanidins in cacao are monoamine oxidase inhibitors, meaning they slow down or inhibit the breakdown of many monoamines, like phenethylamine, like serotonin, like dopamine. Do they do that super strongly? No, but a monoamine oxidase inhibitor can increase the bioavailability of phenethylamine, which is, by the way, this mood-raising neurotransmitter in the brain up to 1,000-fold. So the absolute amount of phenethylamine in cacao is minuscule. It's tiny. Like if you were a chemist, and you took a tablet of phenethylamine, you'd need at least a gram, like 1,000 milligrams, to even notice a change in your mood. The amount in a 40-gram, like ceremonial dose of cacao, and that's a whole other thing we can talk about, ceremonial cacao, but that's like, there's only, I think, like 40 milligrams in, or something like that. It's less than that, maybe one milligram. I've got it in the book anyway. I've done a little table of it. I think it's a tiny amount. But if you think monoamine oxidases can increase the bioavailability, if you've got up to 1 milligram of phenethylamine in that ceremonial dose, then you might end up getting an equivalent dose to 1,000 milligrams. Plus, you've got another thing called trigonelline in there, which ferries it into the brain. And you find that with all the chemistry of cacao, there's all these little fairy dust constituents which synergize with each other potentially. Can I prove that? Unfortunately not, but I do point to a lot of studies in the book where they've looked at like the social effects of like people who eat or drink a lot of cacao. They've measured its effects on like adrenaline and adrenaline levels and cortisol levels. They measured its effects on serotonin in the brain. There's a lot that suggests this isn't just like caffeine and theobromine with packaging, although theobromine is also magic, so I could talk about that as well. But anyway, just I feel like I am trying to, like, there's 14 years of stuff in this one, so like I can't really get through it all in one podcast. But
no. Yeah. So well,
you can go first.
Okay.
There's so many questions we have.
Right. Well, yeah. So I mean, you're saying that the varieties that were bred in Central America are better, like more psychotropic, and more than the wild strains from the Amazon.
That is my suspicion. Okay. Yes, and I base that on the fact that it became so central to their culture historically, and they spent a few thousand years just really developing their relationship with this plant. I also base it on just personal experience with different varieties. Having said that, I know that there will be people who define themselves as cacaoistas who are deeply upset by this, because people have great loyalty to their sort of like, if they're from Ecuador or Peru or whatever, they're like, oh, cacao's the best. And I'm like, well, maybe, I don't know. I haven't tried all of them, but just it makes sense to me that the cultures where it was most central and they've developed a strongest relationship with that plant. And also, as I say, the Criollo subtype, which was the subtype that was most elaborated by hybridization and then by making into drinks and stuff in Central America, is the variety with a different chemical balance to the wild forest stereotype in the Amazon. So yeah, I think so.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the cultivation and how it is a little difficult to grow, and it depends on like a mycorrhizal network and things like that.
Yes.
Yeah. You want to?
Yeah. I mean, I can't. I'm not an agronomist, so I can't speak to that. I can talk a bit about it because I interviewed a few for the books and stuff. But so basically, cacao traditionally in Central America was grown in. This is a Spanish word, so it's a post-conquest word, but they refer to them as cacautales, which are like cacao orchards. So it was always grown with other trees surrounding it, because it's an understory tree. It likes the shade, and exactly as you said, AC, it has the mycorrhizal, like a lot of trees do. There's the mycorrhizal support network, the Wood Wide Web thing. Where they've got all the trees are speaking to each other via the little fungal hyphae of a bunch of things in the soil, and it's necessary. It has this symbiotic relationship with its environment, like many plants do. It's a shade tree. It's also, just because it's so hybridized and so selected, it's very, very disease susceptible. So Criollo is the lowest yielding and most disease susceptible variety of cacao. So like your forest, a lot of the wild, and by the way, there's not just one type in the Amazon. There are like 40 plus different genetic clusters. So we call it forastero, but there are actually, like, biologists have identified like loads of different genetic subtypes. But the Criollo subtype is the most delicate. So a cacao tree will sort of like fruit after about 6 years of growing. So it takes about 6 years to get to a height where it starts producing pods. The Criollo is the longest lived type. So even though it's the most delicate, it's the most like prima donna of all the cacao varieties. It can grow up to 120 years old. So I think the forasteros like grow a lot less old. They sort of like die around 80 or 90 or something. I find it really interesting that the cacao tree grows sort of as long as the maximum human lifespan and no more. Do you know what I mean? I don't know. That's just some little thing that occurred to me when I was researching it. But
it seemed like it has a relationship with humans,
yeah, for sure.
Humans.
100%. I mean, in the mythology of sort of different, I mean, there is not one monolithic mythology for Central America, because like in Guatemala alone nowadays, there are 42 different Mayan languages. There were lots of different indigenous cultures, if you like, which might have shared common tropes and ideals and whatever, but there are loads of different ones. But I'm making that point because it's not like there was one mythology of cacao. There were several. So like, we're sort of picking out of a variety here. But yeah, the cacao was often, certainly in a few mythologies, seems to have been associated with the underworld. And that it seems to have been a mythological pairing up with maize. So, maize is so central to Central American mythology. It's like the plant of the sun. It's the solar plant, right? Which makes sense. It's annual. It grows upright. It's subsistence food. It's bright freaking yellow. It's obviously solar. And then in some of the mythologies, cacao was an underworld plant. And I sort of like do a little compare contrast more in the big books. The little book, I think I mention it in passing, but like the idea behind these two books, by the way, folks, is the big one is the massive one. The little one just came out this year because the publisher said, I think, a little mini version paperback for your, for the readers who might not have the money to splash out on a doorstop like that, would be a good idea. And I did have a lot of people saying, I'm waiting to buy your book, but I can't afford it right now. So I was like, right, okay, good idea. So it's got some of the key points, but it doesn't have all of the detail in the big one. So if somebody's a real chocolate head, then the big one's the way to go. But I mean, like, obsessed like I am, then that's the way to go. But yeah, so the point about the maize cacao thing was there were a few myths, like there's the famous hero twins myth of the Quiche Maya, which you can see repeated online. And I actually got this from a thesis of some guy called Growth. He very kindly published it on the internet. And I was like, this is incredible. He'd noticed in the hero twins myth, where you get these sort of like two generations of twins getting called down to the underworld to play a ball game against the gods of death. So the older generation go down and they get tricked by the gods of death and killed and buried in the underworld by a crossroads. And one of them, like where the body's buried, it grows into a tree and produces fruit. Mm-hmm. Then you've got the younger generation of twins, like their son and nephew, who are growing up in the above ground world of life. And then when they come of age, they get called down to the underworld to play a ball game against the gods of death as well. But in the meantime, the daughter of the god of death, of the king of the underworld, I'm mangling this, it's laid out better in the book, I promise you, but the daughter of the god of the king of the underworld finds this tree growing by the crossroad in the underworld and eats some of the fruit. And as she's reaching up to pick the fruit, the head of one of the twins who was killed is in the tree, and it spits in her palm and she becomes pregnant, which obviously is, biologically improbable, but that's mythology for you. So she becomes pregnant. She escapes the underworld and gets taken in by the twins' grandmother. And anyway, the TLDR of this whole story is you have this 2 generations of twins who get called down to the underworld. They play a ball game against the gods of the underworld. They get killed. But then the 2nd generation of twins manages to outwit the gods of the underworld and comes back and gets revived. But they get revived by... They have this whole like little set of animals who helps them out, and they're killed, and then their bodies are burned, and the ashes are thrown into the river in the underworld, and then they emerge as 2 fish, and then the 2 fish transform into 2 humans, and then these humans trick the gods of the underworld and kill them, and then they leave the underworld as the sun and moon. So it's classic crazy myth-making Dreamtime stuff. But what's fascinating about that, this guy in his thesis pointed out that one of the Mayan names for cacao, one of the Mayan glyphs for cacao is in the shape of a fish with 2 dots. Its Mayan name is 2 fish, because the Mayan word for cacao, one of them is ka. So wa, it's like a pun. So 2 fish. Right. So this whole thing where the twins go into the underworld, they play this game, and then they are killed, roasted, ground, mixed with water, and emerge as 2 fish. It's an allegory for cacao and the tree in the underworld that spits in the girl's palm and whatever. And it's just, so there's the maze, and there's a whole part of this myth which is like the grandmother of the twins. When they go down to the underworld, they tell her as they're leaving, plant some maize in your garden, and when the maize dies, you'll know we're dead. So as she's gone, the maize dies and she's all upset. But then when they get reborn from the river as 2 fish, the maize resprouts, and she's like, oh, they're back. So anyway, that's one myth. There's loads. Wow. So and a lot of these myths don't explicitly mention cacao, but cacao is sort of inferred into them. And then we've got there's some traditional codices, like some late like Aztec or Mixtec codices where there's the tree of the south direction, which was the direction of the underworld in the Mesoamerican sort of indigenous lore, was depicted as cacao. It was sometimes depicted as saber or other trees, but it was sometimes cacao. So cacao was, and also like there's things like Chichen Itza, the Temple of the Owls, which is the temple of the underworld. The lintels are cacao trees, and you've got ancestors emerging. That sort of the sides of the doorposts of the entrance to the temple of the dead. You've got the cacao trees with these ancestors emerging from the bottom of it. So anyway, when you have a look at all of these myths, you sort of realize cacao had a strong affinity for the underworld, seems to be paired with maize, and it makes sense because one is annual, one is perennial, one the cobs grow up and are sort of like yellow, the other has the seeds in a similar arrangement, but they're inside the pith, inside this like white flesh, inside a hard shell growing downwards. One likes the sun, the other likes shade, and they combine together in lots of traditional atoles, the beverages which are made from maize and cacao and all that. So yeah, I could go on, but
that's so interesting.
Yeah.
And so there's like the solar myth too of like the with the grain, like annual dust being cycle. Wow.
I still haven't. I mean, I lay this all out in great detail in the sort of. I divided both books in a similar way, but like the big book is like the first section is like the history. I focus mainly on the pre-Columbian history because I feel like loads of books have done the history of chocolate like since the conquest, but not a lot of them focused on so much the Mesoamerican. The middle section is more like the pharmacology and the traditional medicinal uses and all of that. And then the last section is the mythology. And I followed a similar sort of layout in the mini book, but in the big book I sort of laid all these points out in terms of what does the mythology of cacao actually imply. And it's either that cacao, it seems to have an affinity with Venus in their pantheon, which, by the way, for the Mesoamericans, Venus was a planet of war, not of peace, which is fascinating. Yeah. So affinity with Venus, because the hero twins myth, particularly when they disappear into the underworld, that could be like the daily journey of the sun. You know what I mean? Or it could be the Venus cycle, because as Venus becomes combust, morning star, evening star, time in the underworld, right? So as Venus is with the sun, like conjunct the sun, she never rises at dawn or sets at dusk. You can't see her any of the time. She's in the underworld. So, and Venus phases were hugely important in Mesoamerican divination. Like their whole calendar, the 260-day calendar is associated with the Venus and the lunar cycles. So anyway, I'm not sure whether cacao for them was a lunar or a Venusian sort of thing, or even necessarily whether they linked plants to planets in an explicit way like that. But certainly some of the cacao deities, some of the deities associated with cacao, like I think Quetzalcoatl may have been a Venus deity, because there were different Venus deities. Some of the Venus deities were warlike and bellicose, and Quetzalcoatl was super friendly, but he was a deity that was associated in some myths with cacao. So yeah, anyway, it's interesting. As an astrologer, I'm always wanting to connect plants with specific planets, but I'm aware that is a very sort of Western astrology framing, and I want to be careful not to fully impose my framing on the traditional myth making there, because their framing was different, right? So yeah,
but it still does have planetary correspondences in.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. And for me as a herbalist, I would say it's cacao is 100% definitely a Venus plant.
Okay.
Hands down. Yeah.
In the Vedic correspondences, it's more of a Saturn plant, apparently.
Oh, interesting. I did a whole article, which I can send you guys maybe afterwards. I don't know if it's openly available, but I can send you guys the whole article for the Astrological Association magazine in the UK a few years ago, about where I would how I categorize cacao. And I put it as Venus in Capricorn. Venus in a Saturn ruled sign, because it's this pleasurable, luxurious substance that seems to potentially extend lifespan. Like in the population studies, people who even eat a bit of chocolate, they live on average a bit longer. It has loads of health protective qualities, yada yada. But you've really got to work for it. It's a really demanding plant, and it's also had this tradition association with the underworld and all these Saturny associations. And it also has these martial associations, right? Like it's roasted, like coffee is, and coffee, by the way, I think is a classic Mars in Capricorn plant. That's another discussion, like the exalted Mars, but so I think it's a Venus plant overall, but it's got I can see that Saturn thing, but I think the Saturn is secondary, not primary. But
yeah.
And so what are its elemental qualities in terms of like hot, dry, cold,
Okay, cool. I think, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, I think it's mainly cool and dry, interestingly. But
that's Saturn.
Yeah, it could be, but Venus traditionally is cooling as well. And remember that this is a segue into traditional posology of like applying planetary rulerships to plants, right? So the left turn, but this was a disagreement among some traditional astrologers, right? So you had somebody like Blagrave, who wrote a book on medical astrology.
Of Blagrave.
He's super cool. It's really interesting. Yeah, for sure. I'm more of a Culpeper guy myself, even though Culpeper was a massive plagiarist and most of his herbal was fully plagiarized from Parkinson's. His astrology was on point. And by the way, at that time, plagiarism was just so not a thing. Like everybody just used to do it. So anyway, that's a whole other topic. Blagrave said when he was classifying plants, he argued that, for example, and I follow this, it's very logical. He said something like dandelion, because it was cooling, wasn't a herb of Jupiter. It would be a herb of Venus because it was cooling and it affected the urinary tract. And I'm like, yeah, I can fully see that. But as when Culpeper and Lilly and others were classifying plants, they would be like, look, there's more than one axis. You're not just classifying this on temperature. You're going to look at habit, the mythology of the plant, how it behaves, what it does in the body as a whole. So something like dandelion, yes, it makes you pee, obviously, but, and it's cooling, but it also has this strong liver affinity. It's a very generous plant. I would almost certainly put a dandelion as a Jupiter in Capricorn plant. I mean, partly anything, just it's Jupiter because it's the liver. It helps the joints. It increases bile output, so it has that positive effect on Mars that you'd expect from something in Capricorn. It's also got this reputation as a weed.
Yeah, it's such a joyful, friendly,
it's a beautiful, joyful, friendly plant, and yet it's the poster child for all the weed killer adverts, which is like this fallen planet, right? Do you know what I mean? It's like and also I don't know if you guys saw a meme a few years ago, but when I saw this meme, I was like, yeah, I'm right. It's definitely Jupiter in Capricorn. Where they had roses on one side and dandelion on the other, and the dandelion was growing out of a sidewalk, out of a pavement, and the one on the side with the roses said, "The pH is too high. I'm going to die," and the one with the dandelion said, "Woohoo, concrete." Do you know what I mean? It was just like growing out. And I was like, Jupiter and Capricorn, right? It's like that. So anyway, but so the point is, while I'm not disparaging Blagrave, and I think he's definitely onto something there potentially, I'd probably go with so I think there are herbs of Saturn or herbs of any planet that are like a hot herb of Saturn would be black hellebore, like hellebore, which was used to treat madness. It's very toxic, but it's, to me, that herb is Saturn in Leo. It's Saturn. It flowers in midwinter. It's highly toxic. It was used to treat melancholy, madness, but it's Saturn in Leo because it contains these cardioactive glycosides like the bufadienolides that you find also in some psychoactive toads. Hello, Saturn. But it's Leo that affects the heart. It only blooms in midwinter when everything else is dead. It'll bloom out of the snow. Like, look at me, aren't I fantastic? Everything else is dead. So it's got that Saturn in Leo vibe, you know? So I just think, and it's a hot herb. It's described as quite hot. So it's because everything else with that plant fits with the primary categorization of Saturn. To me, it's like, yes, it's the primary categorization of that plant has to be Saturn. So similarly with cacao, I think it's primarily Venus because for me, what makes it primarily a thing of a planet? What is its essential nature? Is it a benefic? Yes, it's a benefic. It's generally helpful. Is it used in things to do with pleasure and feasting and joyful occasions and romance? Yes, 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 and yes. You know, so it's definitely a Venus thing, but then it has this secondary top coat of, okay, well, you can pop it in a sign as well as the secondary thing. So I was thinking traditionally it'd either be Scorpio or Pisces or Capricorn. And eventually I came down on Capricorn because if it was in Scorpio, it'd be a bit naughtier. Like it would have I could see the Scorpio vibes to it, but it'd have a little bit more like of a hidden toxicity or something, which I don't quite see. And I see the Capricorn bit as fitting mostly with its mythology. I reserve the right to change my mind. I'm still not, but it's definitely a Venus plant in my view.
And the Capricorn too, because of just like you said, how much work it takes to grow it and to make it, you roasting it, you're fermenting it, and even preparing it from like a cacao, like a block, you have to like grate it and froth it. So
yeah, right, exactly. And to me, because but this is circular logic, but I'm because I classify coffee as definitely a herb of Mars in Capricorn, because coffee was traditionally a Mars herb. It was like red berries. It's highly stimulating, and it's in because it's roasted. It's literally coffee is the avatar of capitalism. Like when that plant arrived on the scene, suddenly everything went. You know what I mean? Like it came out of Arabia, like took over the world. And that plant is the plant of the 24-hour day. It's the plant of the grind, literally in every sense, right? So that's the Mars in Capricorn vibe. And the Venus, to me, cacao is Venus in Capricorn. It's always been associated with hierarchy in a positive and a negative sense. Like this, the dark side of cacao's history, there's always been this icky association with slavery and with cultural iniquity, not in every scenario, in every sense, but it's always the flip side of luxury. The flip side of luxury is iniquity. Do you know what I mean? Whenever you've got something that's highly valued, it's often, not always, but often associated with some other like group of people who are denied that thing or work to produce it. So like in Mesoamerica even. Yeah, so exactly, Saturn and particularly that Capricorn thing, which is like steps. It's like, it even like, to me, Capricorn makes me think of ziggurats, you know, the stepped pyramids. And you get to the top and have your heart cut out and get thrown down the steps. But, you know, that's just me. That's the Saturn vibe. I am being facetious, obviously, but I do think there's something very Capricorn-y about it in that sense anyway. But also traditionally Venus was dignified in Capricorn. It had some triplicity dignity, it had some power, it had some quality to it. And I thought maybe Venus in Pisces because it's exalted, and Pisces is literally two fish to go with the hero twins myth. But it does, I think cacao has a bit more of it's literally cool and dry traditionally, and it has a bit more of that hard work vibe to it. And just to circle back to your original question, Isaac, about is it hot, cold? It's definitely traditionally cool and dry, but a lot of the authors, when it came to Europe, like traditionally in Mesoamerica, they just had hot, cold, and they said it was cooling. When it brought to Europe and introduced into the humoral scheme there, they said it was cooling, but it had a heating part and a fatty, moist, airy part to it. Okay. And so it was only slightly cool and dry because when you toasted it, it became more neutral. And a lot of the drinks that were made with cacao and with maize and with spices were regarded as warm and moist. So it's only barely cool and dry, like a fruit would be, like a Venus thing would be. And you can
because Venus is more like moderately cool, whereas Saturn is cold.
It's not like Saturn cold. Yeah. Yeah, where you chuck a quince into anything, the whole thing's just going to taste like quince. Do you know what I mean? So like it's got that really, Saturn has that overpowering astringency where you just need to use a little bit of it, you know. So yeah, I don't know, something like that.
Can you tell us a little bit about the traditional preparation of cacao and how I'm really interested in like the frothy nature of it too, like and the plants that people use to make it frothier.
Me too. That was a big obsession of mine. So okay, so this was the thing, and they used to make. Excuse me, right by a street. They used to make lots of the drinks that were made in Mesoamerica were the highest class of drinks were always foamy or frothy. So one of the bits of research in the book, I was sort of looking at the foaming agents that were used, some of which have been documented before and some of which haven't so well. So I wanted to find out why. The foam was really important because, and this was partly a magical thing, an intention thing, like when you whip the foam into it, they would literally regard it as incorporating life into the drink, incorporating energy into the drink, to the extent that even in modern day Mexico, there's like some of the atoles, which are the maize-based sort of gruels that might be flavored with cacao, like this chocolate atole that they make in Oaxaca nowadays on feast occasions and stuff. You'd sometimes get, if the person who was whipping it didn't have the skill to raise a good head of foam, they bring in a pregnant lady to do it because she's got double the life energy. Do you know what I mean? So like they'll literally. So I thought that was really interesting. So it's like the similar idea to Numa or Chi. The Zapotec name for it was P, which always amuses me because basically I'm 3 years old. But just like they whip in the life energy. It's the word for that life energy through the breath. So foam was really important, particularly in the high end drinks, like all the pictures you see from Mesoamerica with the foam. But I think there may be two different forms of foam. I think there's an airy foam, which is whipping that air in. But I also think there's a fatty foam. And you can still see this in Oaxaca in this drink called tejate, which they sell in. If you ever go to Oaxaca City, you'll see these ladies on some of the street corners and market corners with big bowls selling a beverage. It sort of looks like dirty washing up liquid with like piles of scum on it, but it's not. It's this amazing drink called tejate, which is an atole. It's cold, room temperature, made with corn and cacao and some spices like a native spice called Rosita de Cacao. And the foam on top is sort of fat that's precipitated out, sort of like a blancmange fat that melts on your tongue and has all these aromatics in it from the Rosita and from the cacao. So the plants that they use in tejate now to get the fat they'll use high fat plants, obviously. So like these palm tree seeds, the seeds of a palm called Atalea cohun, which they call guacayules, and the seeds of mamey sapote, which are
sapote,
just for that almondy flavor, right? Okay. They'll grate them and toast them, and typically they'd bash the seed up, toast it on a comal, and then add a little bit of that into the drink to give it that. So that foam has a chocolatey, almondy, vanilla. It's just, I love tejate. Other people have said, whatever. And I'm like, what's wrong with you? It's amazing. It's such an amazing drink. Anyway, I could go on, but the point is that one. So this is really academic and a bit geeky, but when I'm looking at these old pictures of foam, I'm like, I think some of that foam might be just the piles of froth like you see on tejate, which is actually fat. And then others are definitely air, because in a lot of other traditional atoles that are still made in Mexico and Guatemala and Central America today, they use other agents. Like in parts of South Oaxaca, they use this ingredient, which I found the plant, and it was Diana Kennedy, who's a cook, an amazing cook, and who's written a really good gastronomic book about all the different foods and beverages available in Oaxaca in Mexico. Big hardback, like beautiful color book. She talked about visiting this little village, San Mateo del Mar in Juchitan. Put my teeth back in Juchitan in Oaxaca, and this beverage called chow paposh, which was made with cacao and maize and foamed, and they used this vine they called nched there. So I was like, right, I have to go there and find out what this is. So I went there and I found the same lady. I couldn't believe it. I found the same lady. Wow. interviewed in her book. And I was like, could you show me this? So she showed me the plant, and it turned out to be a species of milkweed vine, that are common in the southern US. And it's the inner stem bark of it. And just from photographing and drawing it, I sort of identified it's probably Gonolobus barbatus. And they used the inner stem bark of that as a foaming agent. And there's so little known about the chemistry of this. We know it contains a latex, and that latex almost certainly contains saponins because it makes it really frothy, right? But then on the west, that's on the west coast, beg pardon, of Oaxaca. But then on the east coast in Tabasco, they make a drink called popo. And there are a few varieties. It's like common names of plants, right? There's a drink called popo that's made in central Mexico, and a drink called popo that's made on the east coast, and they're both slightly different. But the drink that called popo on the east coast, I found they used another Gonolobus, but this time they used usually the outer rind of the fruit peel or the root bark, again as a foaming agent. And then in Oaxaca, the drink that I was mentioning, where they get the pregnant lady in to foam it sometimes, the chocolate atole, they use the seeds of Theobroma bicolor, which are a relative of cacao, but they ferment these seeds in pits underground for 6 months, pits filled with water, sort of anaerobically fermented. And after 6 months, they're taken out and dried on mats in the shade until they're completely dry. And then they look like little rubbery balls of feta cheese with black rind. Okay. And then you peel them and you grind them into cacao in a ratio of like 1 part of cacao blanco, or they're called cacao blanco or patache, but these Theobroma bicolor fermented seeds are ground in with the cacao in a ratio of like 1 part of the fermented to 2 parts of the cacao seeds, and they make a foaming agent. But I've done a monograph on them in the big book. I talk about them. I mention them in passing in the mini one. Yeah. For anyone who's interested in like these things in detail, I've actually done monographs on all of these plants in the back of the big book.
That is awesome.
I go into a lot of detail about all of the plants in the back of the big book. So yeah, depends how geeky you want to get. But the Theobroma bicolor, we don't even know how it creates the foam. It doesn't have any saponins in. It's probably some physical properties of it. But yeah, is that the kind of thing you
and then
I mean, there's so many different angles. I'm just talking about
how do they actually froth it? Like the tools that they're using, are they doing aeration like a bartender mixing?
Okay, yes. This is the whole thing. I mean, look, you see illustrations in old codices, them pouring it from a height, right?
Yeah.
And, when you read a lot of these books, like the amazing book by Sophie and Michael Coe, which was a really good sort of secondary source for me. And like, there's some, like, they all talk about how in antiquity, the cacao drinks were frothed by pouring from a height. The only way I've seen it done in contemporary Mexico is with whisks, right? Molinillos, the chocolate whisks.
Yes.
According to all the texts, these were invented by the Spanish and by Spanish nuns. I don't think that's right. And I don't think that's right because there's even like a text just after the conquest that Hernandez, one of the Spanish dudes who's going around chronicling native customs, he wrote like a list, an inventory of utensils required for one of Emperor Moctezuma. Moctezuma was the native name for Montezuma, who we now call Montezuma, one of his feasts. And that list includes chocolate beaters, 2,000 or 4,000 of them.
Wow.
Right.
Why, so that right there, there's some suggestion that they might have needed some sort of beating utensil. And when I travel around in the countryside, and I was obviously these molinillos, these chocolate whisks that you see now, they're beautifully made things on lathes, and they have these little free spinning rings. All of the ladies who I met who were selling chocolate, that's it. Amazing. Thank you, AC. Yeah. So you can see, and you can see 3 varieties of modern ones, 2 larger and 1 little, and then one what was called Molinillo del Campo, countryside Molinillo, which is basically the branch of a cacao tree which has been cut and then peeled, and that was really effective. So
the cacao tree is used to make the tool?
Yeah, exactly. exactly. So I mean, the wood for most of the Molinos that you make bought from markets, I think they use different harder woods, but that one was from a cacao branch. But the point here is that most of the ladies I met who actually made cacao drinks and sold them in large volumes to markets, they had their Molinos specially made, and they said you don't want those extra rings on them. They all had them cut off. She said the rings actually cut the foam. They're beautiful. They show the skill of the artisan, when they're turning it on the lathe, but they say they're for tourists. Like the ones you want are without a ring. And the branch, just that branch, which was stripped with the bits poking off, that was super effective. So I suspect that the traditional chocolate beater was something that was elaborated by the Spanish and then made into this more elaborate thing called a molinillo, which is a Spanish word, sort of like little whisk or something. Molinillo, io being a little bit. So yeah, but I don't know. Again, I have no solid proof for that. Did they foam it sometimes by pouring from a height? I'm sure they did, because there are illustrations showing that.
Yeah, maybe that was
I know from
a thing, like
Yeah. But I'm sure they did. But I know from working with cacao and making drinks of it, particularly with these foaming agents, it works so much better when you froth it that styly, with a whisk, which you hold between your palms and then rotate really fast, and then you just have a central. If you're pouring it from a height, I think. I'm not sure how well that would work. I tried it and it didn't work that well. So, but maybe that's because all the techniques that I have learned in contemporary Mexico from people making atoles are from people who use the whisk. So, do you know what I mean? But
we use a whisk, and we for our
I think it works better. I think it practically works better, and my strong suspicion is they would have had whisks pre-conquest as well. I don't think they're a Spanish invention. I think the Spanish just took it and ran with it, after the conquest.
About all the different drinks with foam, like matcha is a green tea that you frost, cappuccinos, and
foam. I think there's something about this traditional idea of this is one of those perennial philosophy things. Which, by the way, in the big book again, I developed a whole chapter to this idea of discussing around the perennial philosophy. What is it? Commonalities between cultures, which many anthropologists get really freaked out about, because it's sort of like anthropological atrocity to compare cultures. But actually, it's super important. It's the common ideas that are shared between cultures, like ideas of like magical thinking, like certain myths, tropes that crop up around the world in cultures separated by millennia and oceans, who apparently had no contact with each other, and yet they have similar ideas. Obviously, not new to you guys, but so one of the bits about that is like they all have this idea of chi or pneuma or mana or whatever you want to call it, the breath of life. Yeah, so that stuff. And so I think foam is a manifest appearance of that. So if you think about foam, it sometimes often appears in ferments. So ferments like naturally produce foam. So that is a visible sign of life in the drink. And then you find that a lot of non-fermented, but often psychoactive beverages which have spirit in them because they affect you manifestly, will be foamed. They will, if they don't foam naturally through fermentation, they will literally put the foam into them. And it's almost like, look, this is a spiritually alive drink with like living power in it, So there's something like that. I don't know if that's 100% true across the board, but it's often true, as you say, like the matcha and other beverages are foam. With cacao, it's the case.
Yeah, and then those fermented beverages are also like in Northern Europe, ale. Yeah. Well, that was the ritual drink was ale, foaming ale.
Yes.
100%. I'm sure you guys are familiar with Stephen Booner's book, Healing and Sacred Herbal Beers, which I love. Yeah.
That's really cool. That's the life energy. So what are some of, we don't have that much time left, but what are some of the medicinal uses for cacao?
Oh my God. All right. Okay. So So medicinal uses for cacao, there's quite a lot. I mean, in terms of the modern research, we know it's beneficial for the vascular endothelium, for the lining of blood vessels. So it reduces risk factors for heart attack and stroke. Many of them it lowers blood pressure a smidge, but not that much, but it definitely reduces inflammation in the lining of blood vessels. And it seems to protect a bit against the development of type 2 diabetes, or if somebody has type 2 diabetes, reduces blood vessel damage damage. So there's loads of longer term benefits for it in terms of the peripheral circulation. And that can play out into all sorts of things, protecting against kidney disease, liver disease, peripheral vascular disease, vascular dementia, a whole bunch of things, because circulation is kind of important for all of those things. But then you've got, it's also beneficial, I suspect, in terms of, this is again more prevention, but you've got like certain kinds of cancer you're less likely to have if you're ingesting cacao regularly. It's chemopreventive is the technical word against some kinds of cancer like colon cancer. It also lowers cortisol and adrenaline levels, so just reducing the stress on a physiological level is really good for that. The circulatory piece, I think I might have mentioned to you guys before, was also something like erectile dysfunction in men. I've treated a bunch of older gentlemen with that issue with chocolate. I've also, there's so many different things it comes into. I have in the back of the little book and the big book. In the big book, I've got like a 40-page monograph in cacao. In the little one, it's necessarily a little bit shorter. It's like 3 or 4 pages, but I've done a list of conditions in here. So it's just going to be easier for me to sort of mention some of these. So we've got short-term or acute, like instant use. You could have like cough, like cacao is a cough suppressant. I wouldn't use it as a treatment like for helping the immune system or whatever, but bless you, Isaac. I see. So it could be used if somebody.
I had to do some coughing.
Yes. I saw you doing a metalog right there. So yeah. But you can use it if somebody is like recovering from and they're coughing a bit too much. It's a mild cough suppressant. Fatigue, obviously, it's good for that. To aid in recovery from high intensity exercise, for like any gym bros or anyone who's done a bunch of exercise, if you have, anyone who's run a marathon or something, give them a good strong thing of cacao afterwards, and the day after they'll hurt a lot less.
Really?
Because it'll just get that circulation around. And I've noticed, because I do cold water swimming, right? And I've noticed that, and because I don't know, this is my Aries sun side, right? I just can't do it. And like some people wear gloves in winter, and I'm like, I'm not going to do it. My circulation's terrible. I have Raynaud's. I'm like, I'm not going to do it. So what I start doing from October is just doing cold water, the hand training, where you put your hands in ice water and then you gradually build up the time so that when it gets really freaking cold and it's frozen, I can swim without my hands hurting. But I've noticed on days when I've had cacao, I can leave my hands in the water for at least 2 minutes more. It's like, oh, this is so much easier today. Why is that? Oh, because you've had like 40 grams of cacao earlier today. So now it's just like the pain level is much less. So that was really interesting. And then sleep deprivation. They've actually done some trials in trigeminal neuralgia, which is the facial pain that people get in the trigeminal nerve. Say if they've had dental surgery or herpes infection that's caused that. Potentially for angina, for cramps, for recovery from DVT or prevention of on long-term flights. Loads of stuff it could be useful for. Potentially, I think, again, not tested, but for sickle cell crisis, folks with sickle cell disease, it could help recovery from that, or maybe even prevention. And then longer term, we've got prevention of stuff I've mentioned, like furring up of the arteries, chronic fatigue syndrome. There's a small trial showing benefit for that. Hypertension in the latter 3 months of pregnancy, so preeclampsia, stuff like that. Insulin resistance and diabetes, skin damage, ultraviolet skin damage. It doesn't stop wrinkling, sadly, but it does improve blood flow to the skin, and it does improve skin hydration, and it does reduce the likelihood of your skin burning, which is phenomenal. So do tomatoes, by the way. So do things with carotene in, but cacao, I think it's so. Anyway, I won't. There's a whole list of things it can be useful for. So there's a lot of clients I tend to just get cacao into their diet, just sort of 20 grams 3 times a week, like as nibs or just as a drink or whatever, that can help in the background with a bunch of different things. So yeah.
And then I guess there's another thing that we should ask about too, is like, what kind of cacao are you using? Are you giving is 85% chocolate good enough?
Well, yes, if that's all you can get, but I tend to think of chocolate as methadone now. I'm like, this is literally just methadone. So my preferred form is I buy beans myself from there's a guy who read my book called Dan McKenzie in the UK, who's got a UK based company that now imports directly from farmers in Central America. So I buy my beans from him, which is amazing. But you want to, if you're going to buy cacao beans, try and make sure you get them as from the farmer as you can, so they're not getting ripped off, and your source, which might take a bit of research, right? But just get that down first. And then because I have a Capricorn moon, right, or a Crappycorn moon as I call it, so I'm quite happy just doing the like getting the beans, roasting the beans, shelling the beans. If I haven't worked hard for it, I feel like I haven't done the thing. So, but if you're not prepared to be that much of a masochist in order to make your chocolate, then you can get decent like ceremonial grade cacao. Now again, do your research. You might have to buy a couple of different brands because some are better than others. I think one of the best in terms of its effect is Keith's cacao from Guatemala. Keith Wilson, who is one of the guys who originated modern cacao ceremonies, which are a modern invention. They're not, modern cacao ceremonies in their modern form don't really have anything to do with the traditional ceremonies. There's no through line. But I think they're valid because at least they're getting people in touch with this amazing plant and treating it more as a sacrament again, rather than just as a commodity. So anyway, so Keith's cacao is pretty good, but there's a few good brands. And then if you're like, okay, I can't get hold of ceremonial cacao and I'm not going to buy my beans like from thingy and make it, then I think just a block of couverture, like good quality cacao only, like no sugar, no added fat. You can get those from like, I mean, I've only been to the States once. I went to Chicago and I remember going into, was it Whole Foods, which sounded like it would be cheap, but it was really, really expensive.
No.
But I remember they had like, I'm like, my God, like, and then they had tax at the checkout. I'm like, what is this? And then I remembered, oh my God, this is what they do in America. That the price on the shelf is different from the price at the checkout. It's like, anyway, so I was like, wow, this is even more expensive than I thought. But they had blocks of couverture in there. So I was pretty amazed that you sell blocks of cacao over the counter. So you could get those blocks that you can then grate and then make into drinks. And that's super cool. And then you could always get cacao nibs and have little handfuls of that in your food. And then if you can't get any of that, you can have dark chocolate, which is fine. And 85% plus, yes. And then my least favorite, but still all right, is cocoa. Do you know what I mean? Just because it's been the most processed often. And there are some really good quality cocoa powders, but that's sort of like, again, in the back of the little one, I've just done a little triage list of what I think is the best to the sort of least medicinal, but they're all good. They'll all do something.
And then Dutch cacao.
Yeah, Dutch is, yes, thank you, AC. Yeah, so Dutch is the least, just because that's the kind of cocoa powder that has been treated with an alkali, so it disperses in water more easily, but obviously that causes an even further reduction in the quality of the constituents, in its chemical quality. It sort of causes more oxidation, basically. So it's still good. Cocoa powder is still great. I've nothing against it. It's amazing. I'm very happy we have it. But it's just like, I think if you're being a total anal retentive perfectionist, as I am at times, I kind of like want to go I'm like, for chocolate, I am like a food snob cubed. So, it has to be sort of up there. But yeah, no, any form. I mean, even in clinical trials, they found even milk chocolate, which is like 70% sugar, or 50% sugar at least, because it's like, and got milk, and the milk proteins bind to the polyphenols and they reduce the air absorption. Even that has shown some clinical benefit. Wow. So in trials sponsored by Mars and Hershey and other companies, I hasten to add. Sure. So, but still good. And then you asked me about the medical astrology bit.
Well, maybe we should have you on again and talk about.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, cool. We don't want to.
Yeah, we're already kind of past the time. So, but yeah.
Unless you want to for 5 minutes.
No, I'm kind of happy. I enjoyed talking to you guys. So if you want me back at some point, I'm quite happy to come and talk your ear off on a totally other subject. That would be
awesome.
That.
Yes.
So how can people get a hold of your books? And you have a course coming up, or the school? You have a school? What?
Yes. Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Isaac. Yeah. So the books, there is you can get these books off of, if you want. It depends if you're like anti or pro Bezos, but you can get them off of Amazon or Barnes and Noble or other, your usual booksellers. The big one's been out since 2020. There is now a Kindle version of this, which is substantially cheaper. Obviously, the nice version has the color photos in.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
But so if people want the coffee table thing, they might want to get the full thing. But the Kindle version is a lot cheaper for anyone on a budget that's got all the info in. And then the little mini one is just a sort of condensation of some of the main points from the big book. And that'll also be available in the same places. It also, what do I want to say about the mini one? I think that's it really. It's just a condensation of most of the main.
For our listeners who are not seeing the visuals.
Yes.
The mini one is called Pharmacocoa.
Yes. So thank you, AC. Yeah, the big one is called The Secret Life of Chocolate. That came out in 2020. The mini one, Pharmacocoa, Theobroma Cacao in Medicine and Ceremony, that's only just come out last month. And please, my request to any listener or watcher of this would be, if you do buy either of those books, please leave a review wherever you buy it from. Just, leave something, because it just helps sales. And as the author, you get 5 or 10%. So when I'm not coining it in, I promise you, because these books take a lot of research, so that would be super helpful. And the first person who left a review of Pharmacocoa on Amazon left a really, really harsh 1-star review, and I just thought, who leaves a 1-star review? I mean, it's like, I was like, who hurt you? But I don't know. So yeah, well, whatever. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. And I did sort of I used it to make a little video reviewing their review, which I'm going to put out in. And I told you, Scorpio rising, Aries sun. I'm like, right, I'm going to turn my frown upside down and use it to promote my book. So yeah, but I think just any review though is fine. I think it gets more eyeballs on it. So yeah, please do that. So you can also get it from eonbooks.co.uk, but that's a UK based site. So I guess if you're in the States, it's probably easier just to get it from Barnes and Noble or Amazon or something like that.
Yeah. They do. I think they do have a US distributor now. I'm not.
They do. I'll see if I could send you the link for that. Maybe, guys, afterwards I'll contact Eon and see if they can send you a link, because if there's a separate US distributor.
Yeah. Well, I can message them too. Cool. Okay, and then cool. So what's up with your school?
Oh yes, right. Okay, so the new school it's a brand new project. This is just for anyone interested in medical astrology, and it's called Planetarium. So Planetarium. It's actually got an asterisk, plan asterisk tarium. So like planetarium is the gag there, but it's Planetarium, and we've got a new very, very, very tiny YouTube channel where it's me and my colleague Ollie just talking about medical astrological stuff. And so if you're interested in that, just search for Planetarium Astrology. It's still too tiny to come up. We have nearly 200 subscribers, so we're just growing, but really that school is going to be medical astrology for people who are herbal people or medical people into therapeutics. So it's very specifically medical astrology for therapy people. And we've got our first module of our first course is up there, which is astrology for herbalists, module 1 for novices. So this is for anyone who's a herbalist who wants to learn astrology. We've got that first module up, and we've got a few others in the pipeline. And I'm just speaking to a couple of other really cool medical astrologers now, and hopefully they're going to be doing stuff as well. So anyway, that's that.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. Well, this has been a wonderful episode. Thanks for being on the show.
Truly great.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. And I'm so glad I've discovered your channel now. This was set up by Eon, because I was like, how did I not know this existed? It's amazing. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks again, Marcos, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.